Good morning, Morris Maduro. Today I'm talking about Onramp for dynamic leadership. Design. On leadership. I landed on dynamic leadership because I was looking for a system that specifically served small businesses that were engaged in growth and scale. Good morning. Good morning. I'm Morris Maduro. Welcome to Dynamic Leadership. Today I'll be talking about building the on-ramp for placing dynamic leadership in your own organization. I landed on dynamic leadership because I was looking for something that specifically supported small business owners. I wanted something that they could easily teach to others, and I wanted something that is easy to track and measure and can also scale with them. Specifically, I was looking for small businesses that were growing and scaling. Hold on one second. Dynamic leadership met those requirements. As I dug into it more deeply, I found another connection that was really powerful and sealed the deal, so to speak. And that was its alignment with self-determination theory. And I'm going to start with self-determination theory today. About 3 weeks ago, I did a full episode on self-determination theory, followed that with building blocks for dynamic leadership so you can see how the different pieces fit into place. We'll cover that a little bit today. We start building the on-ramp. We're not going to be able to build the on-ramp for the entire roadmap or journey, but we'll build two, and then from there, you can start building out the others with your leadership team or with your trusted advisors. And then I followed that with good comparison or alignment with good to great, great by choice, and some tenets from built to last. And I'll refer to those today. So we're actually hitting all three of those topics. For a deep dive, I recommend going back to the original or to the beginning, which was about 4 or 5 weeks ago, where I started with the dynamic leadership series. I started with making the case for dynamic leadership, why I believe it's the best leadership strategy for a small business that is growing and scaling. In today's event, if you looked in the notes section, there was a link to a Zoom. I've since canceled that Zoom, and I'm just going to do it all in the StreamYard. It just simplifies things in terms of managing different platforms. Because I'll be going live for the second part of this audio. It'll be a LinkedIn audio event. Audio events are a little bit more friendlier on LinkedIn. I'll remain live on my Facebook platforms, Dynamic of Neuroplasticity, 7 fitness areas, and Life Expansion After 50 if you want to check in over there. And that allows me to just manage two environments, the audio environment and the StreamYard. And then with StreamYard, there'll be a link there that you can come on stage so we can have some conversation if you have questions. But we'll literally, the second part from 8 to about 9 will be a working session where we're literally working through your own dynamic leadership, or at least the design of your on-ramp. I'm big on designing the on-ramp and then navigating the on-ramp to get to the steady state. Too many people try to start with steady state and then they feel like they fail because they don't get an A+ grade. They're not 100%. But if you think about it in school, that's why it's school, right? Every single class, you're building on the other one. You're building on the other one. It's 70%, you're still in the game. And we have to adopt that same kind of thinking. I'll make some other comparisons along the way. Let's jump into it. All right, so dynamic leadership, the on-ramp. And again, I was just talking about how we have to think in terms of building on-ramps and then getting into the steady state. And that metaphor has to do with like merging onto a highway. Imagine if you had a 90-degree angle to get onto a freeway and you're going 70 miles an hour. How do you make that? You can't, right? Because you need the on-ramp to shift your direction and your speed. And a well-designed on-ramp, you don't have to slow down, right? You can maintain that same speed and momentum, because the thing is, we're still operating. We still have customers. We still have vendors and things of that nature that we've got to deal with. You have employees. You have to meet the payroll. So that on-ramp allows you to do that without all the stress that comes from trying to make this 90-degree turn at 70 miles per hour, which is not going to happen. So I mentioned self-determination theory. And self-determination theory says that there's three pillars or needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And when these are met, people get intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is an important term because while people recognize that, oh, it's motivation coming from within, what they don't recognize is that it's motivation from the task or the activity itself. So as you make the task or activity enjoyable, motivation goes up. I remember a study, and this goes back behavioral science years ago. I remember this study that stuck with me. They paid some kids. They went into a city neighborhood and they paid the kids $5 for $5 for every hour that they would keep this rock in movement. They had to kick this rock, and the rock couldn't be still for more than I don't know how many seconds, whatever, but it had to keep moving. And the kids, only a few of them actually lasted the whole hour to collect the money. They do these studies with double blind to the research with double blind, et cetera. Then they set up goals, and they had the same exact parameters, same exact rules. Kids lasted hours because they were playing soccer with that rock. They created the game like soccer, whether they knew about soccer or not. They created the game with the goals, and now the activity was intrinsically motivating. This is why people can, I say why people can play gaming, engage in gaming for hours and hours and hours, because it's intrinsically motivating. Now, why is it intrinsically motivating? Immediate feedback, and there's dopamine hits, and there's serotonin, because when you win, serotonin goes up. When you get what you want, the dopamine neurotransmitter reinforces that behavior. And when you lose, the serotonin drops. And serotonin, I say, it's like the one-up neurotransmitter. So when you're doing well, you want more of it, and when you're doing poorly, you keep doing that over and over and over, you run into, I'm not going to say depression, but you get sad. And by the way, this is not about mental health at all. It's about dealing with business work. I'm spending some time on the self-determination theory because it's an important foundation of your leadership, especially as a small business owner. Now, when you take that, what I just said, and think about video games, yes, you have some wins and you have some losses. And when you have those losses, the things are trying to get back on top. If you watch a gambler, the same thing happens. They're winning, they want to gamble more. And when they're losing, they're trying to get back to that winning. And you can see their face just shift and shift and shift as the serotonin drops. That's one of the reasons one of the ways that I will illustrate that intrinsic motivation is at play. And a person can engage in these behaviors for literally hours and hours, and they don't even realize that the time is passing. Self-determination theory starts with two assumptions. Human beings strive for growth, so you want to have some means of them growing and developing. And then the internal sources of motivation are essential. If you look on the right side of the screen here, this is really, and I remember seeing scales or charts of where pay comes in terms of what's important to employees. And often pay is in the double digits, certainly in the second half of whatever that chart is. If it had 10 items, it would be in the second half, often, not all the time. My point is this: look at number 2 is external motivation. That's where pay comes from. And we all have seen situations where people stay in a job that they don't like, or that doesn't pay well. Or they leave a job that pays very well. And some people, they don't make that shift. The takeaway on this slide, and maybe shoot the screen there, the external motivation is not the highest form of motivation. In sales, I've spent a lot of time in sales management, and sales operations. And one of the things I'll tell you in creating incentive compensation programs for sales leaders and salespeople always leave money on the table. Managers who are paid by bonus always leave money on the table. Maybe not all the time, But if you look at the landscape, there's always people leaving money on the table. One of the cool things you can do is you have multiple incentives. You can have the pay, and then you can have the award or the trip and the recognition. That kind of feeds Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And then you can have a higher one that kind of taps into their self-actualization. So you're hitting the incentive from different points. And what we're doing is moving that. You're looking for that group that has the capability but's leaving money on the table. You find another way to incent them. And then, like you could use inner circle, where the people get a chance to shoulder to shoulder conversate with the top leaders in the company, the CEO and the C-suite. And this is that relatedness. So we're hitting on the 3 tenets of self-determination theory with the competence. We're showing that how competent they are. We're giving them access to the top. That's the relatedness piece. And while autonomy doesn't show up as well in that example, it is that they get to make the choice. They're not told what to do. They are given the opportunity, and then they can go after it. So something to think about. It's a way to think about self-determination theory as it applies to your incentives. This thing is, I think one of the books that talks about it is 900 pages, so I'm not going to deal with it on one slide, obviously. This slide here, I try to capsulize everything into one little graphic. You can see context and content is the meaning. So it's unrealistic to say that you're going to build your entire organization structure around what makes the employees happy or what taps into that autonomy, competence, relatedness. And I would say that the closer you get to purpose, the closer you're getting to this environment where people can be intrinsically motivated. But it doesn't have to match their purpose 100%. See, if there's just a 10% overlap, doing something for the greater good is where you're going to find that overlap. They can frame the meaning in such a way that 10% overlap is enough. It's enough to tap in to that purpose, and that's going to help you with the intrinsic motivation. So the meaning, and then tapping into the basic psychological needs, and think in terms of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out if what you're about to do builds on these 3 or detracts from these 3. And if you have employees who are unhappy, you can pretty much talk to them and within 5 minutes find out which one of those 3 is missing. Then we have internal motivation. Extrinsic is low, intrinsic is high. That's the same slide, basically the same message I said before. And then consequence and engagement, feeling, understanding, and behavior. People need to be seen. They need to feel like they're making the choice. Even when I talk to salespeople about their sales process, you want to sell in a way that people want to buy, and you have to let them feel like they're making the choice. So a close is really not you closing them. The close is really helping them get past their own inhibitions about making that purchase. So as I said, intrinsic motivation is incentive from the activity itself. Extrinsic is incentive other than the act itself. Motivation is an internal force that comes from personal responsibility and belief. People are driven by their own interests, values, and passions, but that doesn't mean there has to be a match. If you watch gaming behavior, people will play whatever game is available to them. It doesn't have to be their favorite game. You come up with the game that's number 10 on their list, but if they can game, they're going to game, right? And you can use that example over and over and over. Skiers, and snowboarders, they may not be able to go to their favorite snowboard park, but whatever park is available, they'll go to that park and they'll do it again and again and again. So this is that point I'm making, is you don't have to be a 10 out of 10 on the what, as long as they can get that experience out of it. And then you can't motivate others. You can't inspire them to find their own motivation. That's an important point. I think most people would agree with that. So intrinsic motivation, enjoyment from the activity itself. You see connection to purpose. I mentioned that. Find that overlap. And think about that example that I'm using of it may not be the best video game, but it still gives them that experience. Autonomy, competence, relatedness. And that's what's nice about dynamic leadership and using self-determination theory. Just those 3 things. I could take a brand new person to the company, a person brand new to leadership, and ask them questions. Does this thing add to autonomy, competence, relatedness? Does this thing detract? They give them scenarios and say which one is missing in here. How can you add it? And they can figure it out because people know how to. They know how to do this. This is what we do in real life, right? Outside of work. And then the internal need to grow and attain fulfillment. And this taps into this dopamine. And I'm going to talk about this towards the end where I get into the observable behavior, because you don't want to just tell people what to do. You want to benefit from the conditioning. When sports teams play, they don't sit around and talk about the plays. They get out there and they condition them. They condition them. They condition them. You would say, yes, they're building muscle memory. Is it really muscle memory? Actually, I'll tell you, no, it's not muscle memory. It's nervous system memory. We don't call it that, but it's nervous system memory because the muscles don't have the impulse. It's the nervous system that sends the signal. And the nervous system is the same nervous system that decides what we should say. It decides our facial expressions. It decides what we're going to do. And so that nervous system memory, the same way that sports teams condition their players, is how we can condition ourselves to perform. Implementation tensions is one way we do that. Implementation tensions are thinking, if this happens, I'm going to do this. It's sort of future pacing. So you're creating associations out into the future. The same way on the playing field in practice, they create associations. The opponents do this, you do that. Opponents do this, you do that. And they condition the behavior. Once you've conditioned the behavior, you're no longer relying on management and supervising to tell them what to do. They're doing the behavior itself. And this is why I talk about a 2-year development plan. By having a 2-year development plan, you're building on top, you're building on top, you're building on top. A new player doesn't start with all of the plays all at once. They build on the plays and then they add to them and then they add to them. But having a thoughtful development plan enables that. Why intrinsic motivation? People access their best version of themselves. This is basically repeating what I've said in different ways. It's easier for people to maintain a growth mindset. Intrinsic motivation requires less, or I should say extrinsic motivation requires resources and time that are not necessary when you have intrinsic motivation. And then people are happier when intrinsically motivated. Increased engagement, higher job satisfaction, improved productivity, reduced turnover, fosters innovation, consistency, and performance, all the things that we want. So why isn't dynamic leadership talked about? Why don't we say more about this thing? Why is it, a thing? I mean, obviously, if it's so powerful, why aren't more people doing it? Why am I just now hearing about it? Now, you can Google dynamic leadership, and what you're going to find is that there's very little structure around it because it's extremely situational. It's more situational than situational leadership, in my opinion. The same way that a person in your company, think about this, people in your company, they plan vacations, they fly around the world, they spend a week in a country or 2 weeks in a country where they don't understand the language, and they get along just fine. They don't need to check in with you to find out what to do, where to eat, how to handle this problem, how to get through customs. They figure it out. They're adapting to whatever situation is thrown their way. And what's interesting about going on vacation in a foreign country is that while there are a lot of things that are the same, there are a lot of things that are different. And so you're not into this automatic click word kind of mentality. You're actually having to engage your conscious thinking. The connection there, you look at some of my other events, because dynamic leadership goes along with personal leadership. You first have to have personal leadership and agency, and then you can have the dynamic leadership. To try to do dynamic leadership without the personal leadership and without having the agency, it's going to be a lot more difficult because you're going to be reacting to internal feelings, internal emotions, and those are going to get in the way. So this connection that I'm making about the example of going into a foreign country, people are having to pause. They're not having to just rely on the automatic nervous system response. They're actually having to pause, which is a big part of getting into personal leadership, because you're inserting a pause between your reaction and your response. We don't want the reaction to equal the response. I say a lot more about that. You can go into my event section, and I call it high performance self-coaching. You look at one of those videos. The last one is, I think, comprehensive, and you can get a sense of that work, because that is important here. What can leaders do? just take a screenshot if you like. Do more of the left side and do less of the right side. This is motherhood and apple pie. We know this. If I look at the last 10 infographics I saw on LinkedIn, they probably say some version of this. So it makes sense. And again, why isn't dynamic leadership talked about? I already alluded to one of the reasons. One of the reasons is that there's no structure around it. So universities, in my opinion, universities are the sponsors, so to speak, of leadership styles. And the boards that are governing companies, remember, there's a fiduciary responsibility for a board, and they've got to make sure that they're doing the best with what they have. And so they don't like coming up with some willy-nilly idea. They're going to go with what's proven. So they look to the universities. The universities say, here's the leadership style. They implement that leadership style. They make it work. Dynamic leadership, there's not a lot to teach about. I mean, I'll do a course on it. It'll be 5 weeks max. And it's most of that 5 weeks is building it into your organization. It's not teaching you what dynamic leadership is. It's helping you design what you already understand how to do, but doing it as a leader instead of as a person. It's taking the personal leadership and applying it to leading others. I can go on, but we'll get into that. So here, the other reason I would say, and this probably is more important, is that I want you to experience this. So I want you to read this slide and read it from the perspective of an employee and see how it makes you feel. So as an employee, it probably makes you feel good. You're like, yeah, I like this. This is the way it should be. And yes. Now I want you to read it as a CEO who was put in charge of a company by a board. And the board told this CEO that they have to hit these targets by this date in a year. If they don't hit these targets by this date in a year, then they're out. And by the way, the board also put in place the senior leadership team. So the whole C-suite was put in place by the board, meaning that these are their guys. And now the CEO comes in, and the CEO has to get this done in a year or they're out. Now read it as that person. So you can see the challenge, hopefully, with servant leadership in that, yes, it's good for the employee and the team member. But when it comes to the board and that CEO who was put in place by the board, I don't know if I have the patience to do that. That seems like it might take a long time. That's a long-term play. And we're dealing with quarters here and maybe a year. And of course, public corporations, their numbers are looked at quarter to quarter. Some of your best performing organizations based on great by choice. So Jim Collins, Built to Last, Good to Great, and then Great by Choice. One theme through all of those is these people did not fall prey to the quarterly numbers and that quarterly metric. Sure, they still had to report, but they didn't worry about what this decision was going to do to their quarterly numbers. They made the right decisions for the organization. And this is an important point here because as a small business owner, and that's what this is for, small business, as I've talked about in previous events, somewhere around up to 400 people about. And the reason I use 400 people is because after that, there's too many complexities or potential complexities because of what I'm talking about, like with the board and et cetera, and other stakeholders. You have investors who care more because we're talking about a lot more money. The other thing that happens is the urgency actually is lower above that because you have your revenue per employee can as much as double for companies with more than 400 employees compared to companies with less than 400 employees. Of course, it's more of a continuum. But when you have 2 and 3 times the revenue per employee, you can make a lot of mistakes. You can have a lot of people sitting around doing nothing while you're waiting for the next big thing. That small companies don't have that luxury. So that's why I use the 1 to 400. It doesn't mean that dynamic leadership won't work in a larger organization, but there are some hurdles that you may have to clear, especially time. And I would say one of the things, if you're that CEO and that board, I think the condition I would put in place is, as back to them, my counter would be, okay, that's time out. here's the areas I need freedom of action. I'm going to do it this way in this area, and this way. And by the way, this is going to take more like 18 to 24 months because this is what we're dealing with. It was kind of screwed up, which is why you're bringing me in. And the reason it's screwed up is because of this, this, and this. And that doesn't turn around in 9 months. It turns around more like in 18. So we need to take these metrics and move them out to, you know what, I would create that frame if you're that in that situation, or you don't, it's either win-win or no deal. If you can't get to a place where you feel, because here's the thing, after a year when you're on the hot seat and they're telling that CEO, you're out of here because, and they say, yeah, but this, and yeah, but it doesn't fly. It's over. That ship has sailed. You've got to set that up on the front end when you have some leverage. And then once you create your bubble of what you can do, now you can do the dynamic leadership. So that I bring that out because you can still do it if you're in a situation with a very powerful board. When I say powerful board, I'm talking about in the context of they put both the leaders in place. And so basically, you may take exception to me saying this, but I would say if you look at a CEO of a 400-person organization, privately owned, they're the owner, they have some mastermind groups that help them out, but they're making the decisions. That is a true leader. When you're looking at, and again, I'm going to get some pushback on here, but when you look at leaders who are put in place by a board, the entire team was put in place by the board gives them the strategy. It's almost like those leaders are managers. And I think this is why we have some challenges when it comes to looking at leadership styles, because there's an element of leadership. And if you're a small business person who needed to make payroll, you understand what I'm talking about. There's an element of leadership that some corporate players will never experience. And this needs to be addressed when we start talking about leadership approaches. Now, again, if you read this one from the employee standpoint and see how it makes you feel, just notice how it makes you feel. Now, I want you to read it as that CEO who was put in place by the board, and the board also put in place the C-suite team. And by the way, the board also put in place the strategy. Now read it as that person. You probably notice that it fits much better with that CEO who is being driven to complete certain tasks and hit certain metrics within a very short period of time. That's why people like command and control. But hopefully in that little exercise, you've noticed how these can be at different ends of the continuum and why command and control still will always prevail and why servant leadership will always be rejected by some. So some will always lead with command and control and some will always reject servant leadership. And it's because they don't serve the entire continuum. They're ends of a continuum, and somewhere in the middle is where it works. And that's why I like dynamic leadership. So take a read of that one. You can see that this one has a more adaptive feel to it. It's more about the situation. You know, if you take a sports team, there are some players where the coach is like on their case over and over during practice during this drill. And then in another drill, they're not even paying attention to them. They're on this player's case over and over and over because they're fixing whatever's broken. They're adapting to what's broken. They're not treating everybody as one. And I've read this thing years ago, and I actually live by it. It says treating everybody the same is the highest form of discrimination. And it's because you're not seeing the people. You're not implementing what makes sense for them at the time. You're treating everybody the same. And we've all seen this. Since if you're in sales, you definitely have seen this, that you're a high producer and you're having to live with the same rules and requirements that some of the lower producers have to live with. And it just doesn't make sense to you. Why you have it? And it drives high producers crazy. which is why you want to have levels. I think if you have a senior account executive and an account executive and different, and a lot of companies will do that, but understand that at the highest levels, that top 3 to 5%, that is very unique. You can't teach that. What they bring to the table, you don't teach. You can inspire, but now by having a different label for these people, a different level where they have more autonomy, right? And it's based on their competence. And then there's the relatedness. They have an inside track. Now you can actually get this top group to go even further because they're not held back by the lack of relatedness and feeling of competence, and especially autonomy. You take autonomy away from somebody and they're going to go play video games to get that release. They're going to go, for me, it was sport touring. I would jump on my motorcycle and do a 12-hour ride in the mountains, or to the mountains and in the mountains. And that was and my business was based on sport touring because there's a whole lot of people who needed that release. These guys would take vacation 2 and 3 weeks, rent my motorcycles, ride around the country. They're from out of, Australia, Europe, etc., South America. And they would ride around twisty roads in the mountains. I was in California near the Sierras, and literally 300-400 miles a day, every day for 20 days. They'd leave on a bike. The bike would come back with 5,000 miles extra on it. And my point being, people are going to get that release. They're going to get that connection somehow. For others, it's gaming. For others, it might be horseback riding. For others, it might be going to sports events. Whatever it is, they're going to get that. But the more you can apply it and the more you can give it to them in the workplace, the better off you're going to be. So best practices, that little exercise that we went through, best practices are based on the desired outcome. The best practice in some cases, they support autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Best practices in other instances, they hinder autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So you can see how there can be best practices coming out of command and control. And sometimes they're the right thing to do, but sometimes they hinder it. Let me just talk a little bit, because I spent some time as a military officer, and I didn't go through military school. I went through officer candidate school. So 14 weeks, they got me from an enlisted person to an officer, and I was 24 years old. And as I became an officer, I signed for $2 million worth of earth moving equipment. I had a combat heavy earth moving platoon. So I had scrapers and 5 20-ton dump trucks, 2 bucket loaders, 3 bulldozers, graders, water trucks. You get the picture, scrapers and bucket loaders. I'm sorry, backhoes. That's what I meant. I laughed because the backhoe is like the go-to. You can do everything with the backhoe. I had to learn to drive them. That was fun. But the deal is, I signed for $2 million of equipment as a 24-year-old, and 80% of the people I was leading were older than me and had much more experience than me, because I went straight through in basic and then advanced and then officer school and then airborne and then ranger. So I was younger than most of the people in the organization that I was leading. I was the platoon leader. Later on, I became a commander, etc. My point being that command and control worked because they taught us what to do, and they had a frame. So within my frame, I had freedom of action. I had autonomy within my frame. And this is how the leaders develop in the Army. This is why back in the day, the corporations loved to get people from the military, because they had this development. They loved military officers and non-commissioned officers as well, because they had this leadership structure that they understood. And that's why I think command and control, at least in the US, found its way into the fabric of a lot of organizations. But my point is, command and control worked because there was a combination of direction and rules, but also autonomy. And remember, in the military, we were training all the time. If you didn't have a mission, you were making up a mission. You were out in the field doing training constantly. That was the work. The work was training. So you want to know how Navy SEALs and Army Rangers can be so precise when they go on these missions? It's because they're constantly training. There's other reasons as well. They basically have conditioned a different set of reaction response for these folks. But I'm pointing that out because, yes, command and control can work. But if you don't have that entire structure, the freedom of action, The real and also there was a hefty penalty system in there. I could use Article 15s. I could take pay from people if I wanted to. I could suspend pay. I could take the Article 15 and put it out there, but not execute it and give them 90 days. And if they didn't improve in 90 days, then it would execute. So that had many, many levers that I can pull that don't work in the civilian sector because they're just kind of severe and they create lawsuits. So if you're using command and control, but you don't have all these levers, you're probably not going to. And then what it takes is a charismatic leader to make it all work. The charismatic leader comes in, but you can't train that. I mean, you can, but most people don't have the tools to train that to be a charismatic. It's a conditioning. It's not teaching. You have to condition the behavior. Anyway, back to the point, command and control will have its limitations and it requires other tools that most small businesses are not putting in place. So if you're using a command and control, it's not working. I can tell you that already. And you're probably looking for why it doesn't work. If you're using servant leadership, it's probably not working because you're not getting the compliance that you need. Dynamic leadership can fit that. So here's a quick comparison to start to make this point further. So as you see across the top, the aspect, what it looks like from command and control, what it looks like from servant leadership, and then using that same aspect, but with dynamic leadership. And you can see it, top-down, centralized control, collaborative, bottom-up. You need a combination, adaptive. It moves between top-down. And this is why I'm saying you don't see a lot of teaching material in dynamic leadership because it's not cut and dry. It's not a quick rules-based thing. You have to look at the situation. And so it doesn't serve, maybe I shouldn't say it this way, but it doesn't serve the universities well because how do you do an entire curriculum? How do you do, advanced degrees on dynamic leadership when it requires the situation? But that's been essentially what goes on in the Army when you're constantly training, or the combat arms, I should say. The leader's role, authority figure, directive. And see, this authority taps into cognitive biases. A lot of cognitive biases at play when you look at the leadership style. And that's why I wanted something that was simple. Because when I first started this journey 4 years ago to put this into a package, I thought I was going to be talking more about cognitive biases, but the challenge is cognitive biases is such a vast area and they're different for each person, and trying to understand all of that, it turned out to be a non-starter. But understanding cognitive biases allowed me to create my framework for that replaces the typical stimulus response. And by replacing that framework, I literally address the situation of cognitive biases in that structure. In other words, I take them out of play. And the program, you actually go through the personal leadership and agency. And I don't care where you are, there's more personal leadership and there's more agency, because no one is 100% in charge of their subconscious. And then once you become in charge of your subconscious, now you have personal leadership and now you have agency. It's the being before you go after the having, the be, do, have versus the have, do, be. And then once we have that personal leadership and agency in place, and it could be 3 to 6 months, and then we get into the dynamic leadership. And the dynamic leadership is now you can pull those levers and you're not being driven by your own internal reactions, your own insecurities, your own fear and greed, because everybody agrees people do things to avoid a benefit or a gain a loss. But if you take those up to the next level, you're really talking about greed and fear, right? Gain a benefit, greed at the extreme, avoid a loss, fear at the extreme. And these create other problems because you have conditioned responses, conditioned reactions, etc. And then another one, goal orientation, immediate tasks, short-term goals. There's that quarterly thing, right? Long-term relationships, growth of individuals in the team. And then it's dynamic leadership is more ambitious. It's forward-looking. It moves toward large visionary goals. And I'm going to say something in here because one of the themes that you'll hear me consistently talk about is using a team metaphor versus a family metaphor, or versus some other metaphor that might fit. Political, bureaucratic, friend group. team metaphor is the one that works for me because team, it embodies all the pieces that you need. And I'll have a couple of slides in a moment that get into that. What I like about team metaphor in the workplace is that there's no opponent. So teams have to do that because there's an opponent constantly in their face. Every week they've got a game, or every few days they have a game. And that opponent is trying to stop their every play. Whereas in business, you have competitors. You may have opponents who go out there and hit your links to kind of exhaust your ad spend. And, those games are played. And, yes, so you do have some of that opponent behavior, but it's not an everyday thing where they're in your face trying to stop your every play. They don't even know your plays. But these opponents that sports teams face, they've watched the reels, they know the weaknesses, they know the tells, and they're able to put plays together designed specifically to stop the play of the team that they're going to play that weekend. Where in business, our competitors don't have that view, and they're focused on their own strategy. So we have two offenses running. Imagine having two basketball teams, and they're playing independently, each on their own court, full court. And there's somebody, there's an inbound process to get them to run back and forth. They're going to go and hit as many plays as they can. They're going to have a different game plan, right? It's probably going to be a lot of logo threes, right? They're going to run halfway. They're going to get the ball halfway, and they're going to do that logo three, start again, boom, boom, boom. You're not going to be running the ball all the way into the paint because you don't have to. My point is, and what's that score going to look like? 700 points? I don't know, 500 points? Because there's no limit there's nothing stopping them. And this is why I can realistically talk about 10x. And I do this illustration in other events, but essentially once you get past the noise and you get up above here where there's free running, you have no opponents other than what's coming from inside. And that's why we do the personal leadership and agency, because we want to eliminate those internal opponents that are occurring. And as a leader, you learn to neutralize those internal opponents that people bring to the table. It's not the scope of this conversation, but just know that there's a way to get past that. There's no opponent, so 10x becomes within reach. It's an important point because one of the reasons I think team metaphor is rejected is because there's no fun. There's no opponent. Remember the kids kicking the rock around the street? They lost interest before even an hour. Some of them never made the $5 because it wasn't any fun. As soon as they set up the goals, so sometimes in organizations, they put their own internal opponent in there just because they need to have something to go against. They need an internal opponent. Your opponent is the natural resistance to you doing 10x. This is why when somebody's trying to do 1.5x or 1.3x, 1.7x, it's sometimes more difficult than to just say, you know what, we're going after 10x or 5x or whatever the number, because now it's all of a sudden the goal is big enough to make you want to get out of bed on a bad day of a bad week. I can say more than that. Just let that sit for a while and think about it in terms of the team metaphor, and then what you could do to implement some gamification without creating internal opponents. There's different things that you can do to move that action. And then here's the example of the employee journey roadmap. And this has about, 12, 14 elements. Employee journey roadmap. So early engagement and onboarding. And this is not the orientation. I actually separate that out. There's other items above this, one item above the onboarding, and that is the orientation, which I look at more of the HR. That's more how you get paid and how the working in the organization unfolds, etc. If you think about a team, there's the administrative part of the orientation, and then there's the playing part of the onboarding. So this is the playing part of the onboarding. And in the second hour today, we're actually going to I'm going to work with you to design your own early engagement onboarding, your own task assignment and responsibility, and then your own feedback and development and coaching. All right. So here's some leadership examples. You can take screenshots of these, but the building the right team, first who, then what. And this is from the good to great. Coaches prioritize talent selection, just like Jim Collins. First who, then what. Bill, example, Bill Belichick, New England Patriots, emphasizes picking players who fit within the system and have the right mindset, echoing how dynamic leaders focus on getting the right talent to fit their organization's culture. So you can use these slides as you think about designing your own on-ramp, because these coaches took their framework. And in this case, the business model would be like playing football. In the case of Belichick, playing football and going after the Super Bowl was the target. And then within that, he used his own freedom of action to decide his strategy. So your business model can be what it is. Your vision is what it is. The business model might change 2 or 3 times on the way to its vision, right? That's the blockbuster Netflix conversation. So the idea was the vision is the same, but the business model may be different. And then to achieve the business model, you can change your operating model over and over and over. The operating model is like the playbook. And as an example, as a way to think about it. So you don't have to say this operating model matches that business model. No, your business model. And so if I would say, you don't need a plan B, we're talking about the vision. You're staying with that vision because it's the right one to do. The business model might change. Right? And then I don't think it's going to change every year, but the business model may change 2 or 3 times over an evolution of a company. But the operating model can be very adaptive. And having a dynamic leadership approach, you can imagine this idea where you're changing some parts of the operating model while the other parts are still operating the same way. And then as this stabilizes, now you can change other parts of the operating model, and you're constantly evolving with your company. Next one, adaptability in volatile environments is great by choice, specific, methodical, and consistent. So Putnam, I think it's Howard Putnam, Southwest Airlines. He was one of the companies that made the cut from good to great by choice, because he was able to keep getting those high performing results after the volatility of the economic crisis in 08. And that's essentially the book's Good to Great looked at these companies that were for 15 years able to get these outsized results compared to the comparison companies. And then after the financial crisis, some of those companies just literally disappeared. And then what Jim Collins and his team did, they went and looked at which companies sustained it even after the thing. Why some companies disappeared, other ones kept going. And Southwest was one of the ones that made the cut. And his specific, methodical, and consistent was he would only use 737s by example. For example, they were fast turnaround. He only had to have one kind of simulator, training version of training manuals. All his pilots could fly all the planes. So he had a very specific, methodical, consistent approach. So all the VUCA around him, the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, it didn't matter. It didn't affect him because his approach was so consistent. And that's what I talked to you guys about. And the example here is Phil Jackson with the Bulls and the Lakers. Chicago Bulls did it, Phil Jackson, but Los Angeles Lakers, they were also known for this triangle offense, which basically moved the players around into these triangles. And they always knew where their teammates would be, because they would have a guy move from the weak side of the court to the strong side. But it always was creating these triangles. And so they always knew where to pass, and it made it very difficult for the other team to double team. Again, these are just like, I'm changing my operating model. The business model is still the same. It's get to the NBA playoffs. It's become the champion. But the operating model will be different. Fanatic discipline. This is from the 20-mile march. Out of great by choice, I should say. And here, this was the 2 guys were going out to the Arctic on expeditions, and one of them did 20 miles a day, no matter how good the conditions were, how bad the conditions were. Sometimes he didn't quite make the 20 in these really severe blizzards. They did everything they could to get that 20. And then things were good. They didn't do 30 days to make up, 30 miles to make up. They did 20 every day, 20 every day. And then he built into his plan that he knew there would be some misses. But this is like that 100% versus 70%. Just because you hit 70% today or 85% today doesn't mean you have to make it up the next day. It's just sometimes you don't get the A on the test, right? But that 20 miles per day. And that's where the 20, and you can look up this 20-mile march and it shows up in a lot of different places. And in this case, the Alabama football coach, the importance of focusing on the process, always the process, always the process. And he didn't worry about deviating their preparation. Different strategies, fire bullets than cannonballs. This comes from Great by Choice. And the idea is that you test, and I love the example because in small business today, one of the huge advantages small businesses have is that they can test over and over and over. And you can use, like I talk about ClickFunnels. ClickFunnels is on its way to being an enterprise solution. And so even if you have a web developer and a huge website and, you know, $1 billion company, several $100 million company, you can still have ClickFunnels running inside, and with 8 o'clock come up with an idea. 10 o'clock, your ClickFunnels developer can actually have A/B testing out with consumers in 2 hours. It's a very powerful tool to do the bullets and then cannonballs because you can test and test and test. And you're not interacting with your developers. You're not having to spend money. You're not having to have these design requirement meetings. You just decide, here's what we want to say, boom, boom, boom. And then while it's going, they could literally change the A/B testing on the fly. This is working. What if we change that? Now you do ABC testing and just keep scaling up. You can literally do this for 2 or 3 days, get a sense of how it's working, and then decide, do we want to do this or not? Greg Popovich, San Antonio Spurs, known for trying out new player. I like this example though, because of he would try new combinations and offensive strategies during the regular season before solidifying them in the playoffs. Think about this. He is priming them every day. They're talking about these things because when they get to the playoffs, these things because he is priming them. So basically, over time, the playoffs, you're talking about affirmations, right? Or incantations. The playoffs is not even a question of they're going to make the playoffs. It's which plays are going to make the cut for the playoffs. A very, very powerful tool. And when you look at life from a conditioning standpoint, these things are fascinating for me. And then we have creating a winning culture, preserve the core, stimulate progress. And this is from Built to Last, build a strong team culture. Winning coaches cultivate a culture that defines what their team stands for. It's not about politics, right? It's not about favoritism. It's about having this thing that's bigger than everybody. John Wooden, he established a team culture based on values of teamwork, hard work, and integrity. His pyramid of success was both a framework for preserving core principles and stimulating continuous growth. One of the things that John Wooden is known for is at the beginning of the season, he would teach his players, the first practice was how to tie their shoes. Now, the logic is that you didn't want your shoes to come loose and you didn't want to get blisters. But imagine your organization having a 2-year development plan for every employee. I don't care if they're an experienced leader or an entry level. Obviously, the development plans would be very different. And one might have 24 touches in 2 years. The other one might only have 6 assessments or 4 assessments in 2 years, or 2 assessments, things that they've got to do because they have the experience. But imagine a development plan that it's taking into consideration things like tying your shoes. And what does that look like in your organization? And that's, by the way, why I'm showing you these examples. So as you start to build your own Onramp, you do it based on what you want. You have the autonomy in the agency to do it the way you want, and then what you're going to teach your other leaders to do. So I don't care how much experience they come to you with, you can have them go through your development plan. And then I'll have you do a screenshot because I want to give us 5 minutes to take a break before we start the next segment. And we have emotional intelligence, player development, self-determination theory. We said quite a bit about that, connecting with and developing individuals. Great coaches understand that they need to connect with each player. Steve Kerr is known for his ability to manage diverse personalities. Phil Jackson did this as well in the Dennis Rodman, Scottie Pippen, Steve Kerr, Michael Jordan days. He had all these unique personalities and he was able to get them to work because he saw each person and he didn't have them competing against each other. He had them competing against becoming their best version of themselves. All right, so now I've talked about this before. I'll talk about it some more when we get into the next segment because I want to get to here. So this is design your own Onramp. We already showed this one. And this is going to be on the link that I show you. This is the project template that will be on that link. We're going to work through this project design template in the audio event. And then here's where you can get that template. Now, if you are on LinkedIn, you'll be dropped off because I'm going to do the audio event on LinkedIn so other people can join. If you're watching from one of the other platforms, you can stay in here, you'll continue, and you'll see me working on my working document. If you are not in any event and you want to get into one, then go into the description of the audio event or the LinkedIn Live event. So that's the audio event. You'll see it has the headphones there. That's how you'll spot it. Or the other one, the LinkedIn Live event that's going on LinkedIn. In the link, you'll see that you can join the webinar, and you'll be in the webinar. You'll see the document. I'll be working from a pad as we fill it out. And then we'll be able to do some Q&A. I'll put a link out there so you can invite yourself onto the stage and we can have a Q&A. All right, so we're going to take a 5-minute break there. Let's see. I'll do 5 minutes. Call it 4. All right. I'll be back in a little under 5 minutes. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the LinkedIn audio event. I've got a couple of things going on here. One is there is a webinar going concurrently, and you're welcome to join that webinar. If you go to the audio event description, you'll find a link there for the webinar. By clicking that link, it'll bring up an opportunity for you to register. The advantage of getting into the webinar is that you'll see me working through on a pad. I'm going to be using a pad that I worked through. There won't be slides so much, but I might refer to a slide here and there. But the main thing is I'm going to be working from a pad. But the other thing is, so there's going to be two audiences, right? There's the webinar audience, and you can come on live. And then there's also the people in the audio event who can come on live as well, and we'll have some conversations about that. I'm gonna wait for a few more people to join in the LinkedIn Live. And let's go back to a slide where all right, we got that. Now, in this event, I'm going to be using a project design template that you can use. And if you go into the audio event or the description for whatever event you're watching, wherever you're watching it, you go into the description, you'll see a link, and that link will have you open a project design template. That project design template is going to be what we're working through as you design your on-ramp. And that's what we're doing in this hour. So the last hour I spent talking about elements of dynamic leadership. And so if you didn't go through that, you might feel like you're a little lost, but you'll pick up on it. But I definitely would go back and watch that and then tweak it. I gave some examples of coaches who were applying what amounts to dynamic leadership. And a big part of it is self-determination theory. And if you're brand new to this conversation about dynamic leadership, just think in terms of intrinsic motivation is what employees have when they enjoy the activity itself. So if you think about how long people can play video games for hours and hours, it's that intrinsic motivation because the joy is coming from the activity itself. And what we want to do is in the workplace, create this situation where the joy or where the incentive, the reward is coming from the activity itself. And that's what we're doing. So self-determination theory says there's three needs that have to be in place for this intrinsic motivation. And that's autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So I'm going to go for those people who are just now tuning in. Here's some leadership examples. Let me go back here. First, I'll do a quick comparison. So I did a comparison between command and control, servant leadership, and dynamic leadership. And the reason these two is because, hold on a second. The reason I use command and control and servant leadership is because they're sort of at ends of the continuum, and then dynamic leadership moves back and forth between those two in a sense, depending on the situation. So for goal orientation, for example, command and control, immediate tasks, short-term goals, servant leadership, long-term relationships, growth of individuals and the team. And you can see sometimes we have the patience and the luxury of doing that, but sometimes we don't. So I would say sometimes you need the command and control, sometimes you need the servant leadership, and then you have dynamic leadership as ambitious, forward-looking, moves towards large visionary goals. And that's where some of that intrinsic motivation comes from, as people are focused on getting reward from the activity itself. And then I want to, you can take a screenshot of these are some examples, leadership examples, sports team coaches applying what amounts to dynamic leadership in their own way. I use the example of the business model being the game, right? Getting to the Super Bowl or the championship, becoming the national champion or whatever. And then the operating model is how you apply your strategies from week to week. And in a business, your vision may never change. Your vision and purpose may never change, but your business model, this is the Netflix versus Blockbuster conversation. The business model may have to adjust and shift. And for those who don't change the business model, well, that's the Blockbuster and Netflix, right? And then under that, you have your operating model. So you can have one business model and change your operating model several times under that. Just because you change your uh, just because the business, I'm sorry, just because you change your operating model does not mean the business model has to change. You can change your operating model to adjust to external situations. And then there's another one. This one is using ideas from Built to Last and Coach John Wooden. I gave the example that John Wooden would start his season off. The first practice was how to tie your shoes. Now, logically, that made sense because you don't want players getting blisters. You don't want players' shoes coming loose at a critical time in the game. But the fact for a small business, think about having a development plan that's granular enough where you're actually thinking about the equivalent of how to tie your shoes. And then the balancing optimism and realism. This is the James Stockdale. He was the prisoner of war, and his idea of, even though the situation was dire and looked like nothing could ever happen good, they still had this relentless belief and optimism that it was going to be okay, even though they also acknowledged this is like mental contrasting, where you know it's going to be tough, but you're going at it, and every day you're faced with the fact that it's tough, but you're still going at it, and you're going at it like you know you're going to win. It's this balance, which is very important, which gets back to mental contrasting. All right, so that's a quick review of where we are, and now here's a slide. So for those, let's see who we've got in the audio event. So for those folks in the audio event, I have a slide, and you'll be able to find this. As I say, you can go to that link. You can also go to the end of the audio, the dynamic leadership LinkedIn event, that live event. You can go to that and go to the last, I would say, 6 or 7 minutes. You'll find this slide. I don't know if you have two screens or you can watch it on the computer or the phone, but anyway, here's the slide. It says 3 examples of supporting intrinsic motivation. And I'm covering this one because now we're going to get into using this project template. And I hope you download the project template, because on the second part of it, I have the some of the journey, the roadmap and the journey that you can use. I also have the comparison between command and control and servant leadership. So on this slide, I have 3 boxes. The first box says feedback, observation based. So in this way, I'm talking about feedback should as much as possible be observable. I call red, white, and blue language. Blue language is observable. When you use observable feedback, I like the way you did X, Y, and Z because it led to A, B, C, whatever. As opposed to you're doing a good job. You're doing a good job would be red language. Describing the behavior takes a few more words. That's blue language, because you're actually tying it to a specific behavior. They did this and you did that. That was exactly what we want. That's blue language. And then white language is describing what's not there. You didn't do this. You didn't do that. You weren't present at the meeting. It doesn't look at what you were doing. There's a billion things anybody on any given day is not doing, and telling them what they're not doing is not a way to motivate them, because it doesn't give them any direction of what to do. So that's the observation-based feedback. 3-to-1 ratio. That's talking about 3 positives or praises for every 1 reprimand. And we're not talking about praising and reprimand in the literal sense, but you want to give 3 acknowledgments of good work, good feedback for every 1 that's going to be some kind of a reprimand. And the way you do that is by using observation-based feedback, and by using a long-term development plan. You have the opportunity to always be giving feedback. And you can always give your feedback in the context of a start, stop, continue format, which is going to be, it's like a positive sandwich, right? Like a praise, reprimand sandwich in a way, start, stop, continue. But the development plan gives you the context for having these conversations. Growth mindset, you want simple things like using the word yet. Yeah, you're not quite there yet. That fosters a growth mindset. You're not doing it we don't quite have it yet. That's a growth mind that fosters a growth mindset. Versus you didn't do it, you failed, it didn't work. And of course, that's also white language. So you want to use that yet. And then checkpoints. I think checkpoints, we're leaving money on the table because we don't have them. A lot of companies don't have checkpoint meetings at all. In California, there's such a high bar to become a salaried worker, an exempt employee, that we have people literally managing stores, major stores, and they're hourly workers. And so hourly workers tend not to get checkpoint meetings. I don't know why that is what it is, but the challenge is checkpoint meetings to me, and then other companies look at checkpoint meetings as something that are for when people are doing poorly. They're on a performance management plan. First of all, I would say a performance management plan is not a negative. A performance management plan, I know how it's talked about, but a performance management plan is we're going to manage performance and make it better. That's why we have the development plan. And checkpoint meetings are a way to talk about the development plan and the progress and the next level and taking the next steps. Imagine a sports team that never had practices. Imagine a sports team that had practice but never had feedback. Now, you don't have a game every week in your business, but what I would say is that you have opportunities that show up every once in a while, and those are your opportunities to make major ground on 10X. And that's the big game for you. And you don't know when those big game moments are going to show up. So we want to keep building that team and preparing them. And that's when the stakes are highest. We've all had those existential crisis feeling moments, and that's what you're preparing these people for. And then rewarding the desired behavior. So this is conditioning. You would never expect a sports team to rely solely on telling the players what to do. They condition it. They condition the behavior. And by the way, the reason why blue language is so important is because it literally conditions the behavior. You see, when I use red language, you did a good job. We're attaching the language, we're attaching the good feelings, the dopamine, the serotonin boost that comes from that. It's getting attached to me as the leader. And so when I'm not around, we don't know what that person is going to be doing. When you have blue language, it's attached to the task. It's attached to the behavior. Now the dopamine release and the serotonin boost is attached to that behavior. It's like the gamification. It's like why the people can do gaming for hours and hours. You're literally improving the intrinsic motivation by using blue language. So that's rewarding the desired behavior with blue language, conversation with relatedness. It also helps with the self-determination theory, right? Because the competence and relatedness get tapped there. Then the next box I have is empowerment. Progressive, and this is the developmental plan. We want to have something that's progressive, always building on, getting better. Capability based, so we're looking at what they can do. We're not just training everybody the same. You're doing an assessment of what people need. And I have a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 format. Now this is kind of generic, but if you think about it, if I give an assignment, I want to have a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So this week we're going to meet 5 days. Next week we'll meet 4 days. The following week it'll be 3, then 2, then 1. But that can also be in 1 week. You say today with this new test, we're going to meet 5 times today. This hour, this hour, this hour, to get them to make sure they're doing it right. Then tomorrow we're going to meet 4 times. Then we're going to meet 3 on Wednesday, then 2. Or you can do it months. You can do it over a month. We're going to meet 5 times this month, and then the next month we'll meet 4 times. Whatever it is, it depends. My point is that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, you're recognizing the fact that people are not going to come out of the chute 100%. I talked about this before, right? You've got to have this latitude to develop and get better. That's where the growth mindset comes in, because you're rewarding effort and activity, not just the result. This 70% is passing in school, and then all of a sudden we hit work and it's 100. 100 is it, and anything else than that you're losing. We want to get away from that, and that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 acknowledges that there's a growth track that has to hit. Aligned with strengths. So empowerment should be aligned with strengths. Everybody should not get the same level of empowerment. You want to empower people based on what their strengths are. And that's getting back to the competence and the autonomy of the self-determination theory. Having freedom of action, that's the autonomy. But again, everybody doesn't have the same level of freedom of action. You hear a lot of situational basis that I'm using because that's what dynamic leadership is about. And I'm showing you this, I'm going through this now because it sort of sets the stage for where we're going to go as we start building on the project plan. Again, you can get this project template if you go into the description on the wherever you found this webinar or this event. In there, I have a link to the project template. And then we have including development. So I have made the statement, I'll make it over and over again, that companies should have a 2-year development plan for their employees. Now, for some employees, that might be 24 touches. For other employees, like experienced leaders, it might be 3 or 4 touches in 2 years. But if you consider what goes on in the military, in combat, they're always training. They're constantly training. There's always another level to go to. That was the reason I brought up the John Wooden, tying your shoes at that level of granularity. So yes, they have leadership experience, but I want to train them. I want to develop them based on what we need. And development can have things like, presenting to this level of group, or another one might be working through a succession plan for their team. Another one could be conducting a checkpoint meeting for a high performer, conducting a checkpoint meeting for a person who needs improvement. Another one could be conducting a year-end appraisal. Now, some of these might be just checks, right, where an experienced leader knows how to do the appraisal, but you also might pick up 1 or 2 things that they may be doing wrong. Remember, leaders come to us from different metaphors. They could come from a family metaphor. There were no appraisals. They might come from a command and control metaphor where it's all about, fear, motivation. So even though they know how to do a year-end appraisal, they may not do it the way your organization is doing, which is based on a team metaphor. So here's where we're flexing that nuance a little bit, and we're doing it early on in the development plan so that we're all on the same page. So definitely including development. And then the third box is checkpoints. And an easy format, if you've never done checkpoints or you don't do checkpoints, I would start with, first of all, do it about yourself. Start with a start, stop, continue. In the context of building a high-performing team, and I would start this with high-performing employees that you have a good relationship with, so you get your own comfort. You need reps, right? The first time you do it, you're going to be it's going to be probably a little bit rough. You'll also find that when you do it with some employees, they really kind of resist this. So you need to do some reps and get comfortable with it. But in the context of building a high-performing organization, what are some of the things I can do as a leader to support you to move in that direction? What are some of the things that as a leader I should start doing? What are some of the things as a leader I can stop doing that may be getting in the way? And then what are some things I can continue doing? So it's that like praise sandwich, as a praise reprimand sandwich, so to speak. And then do it with them. After you've done that with yourself a few times, then you start doing it with them. And I would always do both. In a checkpoint meeting, I would do that. I would do myself first. It's like a live 360, right? What can I start doing? What can I stop doing? What can I continue doing? And what often happens, the things that I was going to talk about with the employee about what they could improve, I'm causing some of the problem. And so their start and their stop and their continue actually gives me feedback that says, ooh, I'm creating the friction point that's causing the thing that they're having trouble with. Easy enough, just remove the friction point. It was surprising to me how often that was the case. And it's because I'm solving problems as they're coming up and I'm not recognizing their model of the world. Like they may have a model of the world that says, this is how I do this. When this happens, I do that. When that happens, I do this. And I've got this thing in place that was put in for some other reason, and it's getting in their way. So having that conversation is a two-way. And then from there, once you're comfortable with that start, stop, continue approach, you can start expanding your checkpoint meetings. There's different forms you can use. Again, as a leader, you can come up with your own way of doing it. But I would always go back to the team examples or the team metaphor. And that's why I gave you those slides of the approaches that different coaches are going through. And now we're going to, let me just back up to that. Oh yeah, two-way feedback. So that's the live 360. I also recommend doing full 360s if you can, if your organization allows it. Definitely do some full 360s. I would do Myers-Briggs. Myers-Briggs is a real eye-opener. The biggest area of breakdown in organizations tend to be in the N and the S dimension. So N is the intuitor, S is the sensor, and it's almost breaks down in terms of operational excellence versus project excellence. And one group wants to change things, the other group wants to keep things the way they are. And it's the biggest breakdown in business or in organizations. And by organizing your teams in such a way so that you have both represented makes a lot of sense, especially as you're thinking about projects. So projects, I probably would have more N's, but I need some S's in there to keep me grounded. And in the operational, I'm probably going to bias more towards S's, but I need some N's in there to look for opportunities for improvement. You could also use it with your listening. If you know you're talking to an N, you know they're biased towards improving things, and you may have to like cut the deck a few times. You get the point. But Myers-Briggs is a huge. When I was building high-performing teams, I did whenever I had a new team to build every 2 years because the way the work was structured. I always had my senior leadership team go through Myers-Briggs. We did it together. So I've gone through Myers-Briggs probably 7 or 8 times through the whole thing. So I wanted to go through with the leadership team. And then we all understood each other's strengths. We understood our propensities, et cetera, and that applied. And then the checkpoint meeting should feed the annual review. I also put in there developmental. So checkpoint meetings have to be developmental, where here's where you are, here's what we need to be doing. You're not here yet in this area, and here's what's next. And always building this next. And that's sort of a gamification, because it's like gating. Imagine training a kid to ride a bicycle, and first you want them to ride and pedal fast enough with training wheels or with you holding a seat. And then they have to learn how to get the bike to balance and steer. So you keep them on the sidewalk for a while, and then they get good enough, you let them go in the street, just in this area, just on your block. And then next thing you know, they can go around the block. So it's that same developmental thing. It's a gamification. So they're motivated to get better at steering. They're going to start showing you how they could turn into the driveway and at a high speed, and how they could do all these things because they want to earn that right to go in the street. As an example, you can fill in the blanks if it doesn't quite fit. And then the checkpoint meeting should feed the annual review. So I don't believe in doing things that are not going to be used. And we don't do checkpoint meetings for the sake of doing checkpoint meetings. Checkpoint meetings are to feed the annual review, but it's not from the standpoint of, I believe this person is a mid-level player, so I'm going to back into that. No, what you're doing is that checkpoint is an opportunity for you to shoulder with them to become the best version of themselves possible within that time frame. And that's going to help the annual review. So it's not about the annual review. It's about them becoming fully competent and earning more autonomy so they have freedom of action, and then making sure that they have access to the tools and resources, which is the relatedness. And then I mentioned conditioning behavior. All right, so here's what we're going to do. There's that link. For those of you, if you can't see this or you can't get to the notes, I'm going to go, it's the link is https:// of course, but it's a bit.ly link because it's a Google Doc, and the Google Doc link would be too long. So I just did it this way: bit.ly/4 small e large W large K small y large P, and then the number 2. So bit.ly/4 little e capital W capital K little y capital P, and then 2. Again, if you can get to the description, then you'll be able to download that. So this is a project template, and it's a leadership template. I've used this leadership template, project leadership template, with $1 million projects. And now it's not a project management template, so don't misunderstand. What I wanted to do, so if I had a large project, there were multiple project managers, and I would have each project manager do this template, and it would be a facilitated conversation with other people who are stakeholders. We would do a facilitated conversation because I wanted people to be part of that. And by having everybody build this, it became a one-pager that I could just look at. And here's what's interesting about using this. Even on a 2-year project, when we went back and looked at these, they did not change because we did it at the design stage. We got all of the thinking. See, if you're used to project management, maybe not so much with Agile, but certainly back in the waterfall days when I first created this. But it works with the Agile as well. It's just that Agile has other tools that you can use. But if you're not in technology projects, you may not even know the difference between the waterfall and the Agile. So this works. But we're building it based on what we know today, and it's from a leadership view with the vision in mind. Once the project gets underway, then we have all these other factors coming in. We have stress, and we have all these urgencies and things like that. And that could impact what goes on with this project template. All right, so you're looking at this project template, project name, obviously that's pretty self-explanatory. And so in this case, what I'm going to do is, let me, got to fix this, hold on. Okay, there we go. For those people online who are watching. And now what I need to do is go to, I'm going to go to the design your on-ramp. So we're going to design the on-ramp for early engagement and onboarding. So we're going to call it onboarding. I encourage you to go through this with me. It's not an intellectual exercise. You will get better and better at this. The purpose is to create a high-performing environment. And this, you use your own words. I'm just giving you an example of how I would do this. I've done hundreds of these literally over a 20-year period. Create a high-performing environment one team member at a time. So you see how I did that? And that's, again, this is just an example, but you see how I did that in a way that I'm creating some parameters around it while I'm giving the description. Let's see if I could expand this a little bit. All right. And then this next area, doing what, for whom, and why. Now, this one is interesting. If you are a middle manager, director, something like that in an organization, think of the whom as the sponsor. Who's paying for it? That's the whom. If you're a small business owner, you could think of this as stakeholders. Doing what, who are the stakeholders, and why? Because what I don't want to do, though, is make this all about the end user. So if you're building a marketing plan, it should be built for the organization and not the end customer. You're going to get to the end target prospect or client profile, whatever. You'll get to that in the guiding principles and in some of the other parts. By the way, if you go to the bottom of this project template that you've downloaded or that you're accessing from Google Docs, you're going to find the two resources in there. One, you're going to find more of this, the onboarding, and then task and assignment responsibility, these different parts of the roadmap. And you'll also find below that, you'll see the comparison between command and control, servant leadership, and then dynamic leadership. All right, so what are we doing? We're designing, not building. We're designing, because remember, this is a project leadership template. Designing, onboarding process. Now, here on the appendix, I have onboarding is after orientation. I'm just putting that as an example. So we have this, you see how I'm using the appendix there. And the point being that I want to separate it from the orientation, because the orientation is something that is more like HR. We don't want people thinking about pay and vacation and sick and off time, maternity leave and all. We don't want them thinking about that when we're working on the playbook. So we get that out of the way. And by separating it, there's an HR conversation around the orientation, and then there's a leader conversation, and that's called onboarding. And that onboarding kicks off the developmental plan. Supported vision, and that would be the vision of something, right? What your company is doing. So becoming the best or achieving this or whatever it is, whatever that articulated vision or purpose of your company is. And you can make it down at the team level, but it should be something that's significant like that. Why? And this is where you can start talking about, because we want to make the world a better place kind of thing. I don't want to say it's all motherhood and apple pie, but this is where you can tie into your target market. And why are we doing this? We're doing it because we want to be the premier provider of healthcare or the premier provider of this, or we want to improve consciousness in this area of we want to create a one application that solves all the business needs. It's going to tie back to your vision. So a lot of times on the project, the why would be because it had to fit into something else. It had to enable something else. So what is it going to enable? Think about it like that. This will enable something else. And that will, so when I had project managers under me who also had sub projects that were all interrelated, they would be enabling something else. And it might roll up to my big project, or it might support a lateral project, but that's going to be different. In scope is important. And this scope section is important. So in scope, we're going to have discussion of development plan, discuss development plan. We're going to have roles and responsibilities and how exceptions are done. We might have how special assignments are created. We're going to talk about checkpoint meetings, what they are, what they're not. We're going to talk about the annual review process and how it relates to succession planning. See, a lot of this, people may say these are difficult topics, but when you have them in an onboarding session and the person is new and you're giving them the lay of the land, what you're doing is saying, hey, we're operating from a team metaphor, and here's how this team works, and here's how you could be a player. It starts to make sense that way. You're also positioning it in a very neutral stance. You're saying, here's how to become the best version of yourself. You're not saying that you have to do this work or else. There's no fear motivation. This is an adult to adult conversation. And by the way, I think dynamic leadership helps with that. It keeps you from falling into this parent-child type relationship. And it keeps us out of this people pushing back just for the sake of pushing back because they don't like being told what to do. The outer scope is an interesting one. It would be very easy to list 100 things as to out of scope. But what I use out of scope for, and you see it smaller on the form, I use out of scope for those things that seem like they should probably be part of it, but they're not. So I would say orientation is out of scope. Parentheses, HR handles that. I would say that leadership training is out of scope. It doesn't mean we're not going to do leadership training. It's just that in the onboarding, and again, if you look at that, if you go to that document, there's different steps, that different parts you've got to onboard. You have to do the checkpoint that you have to develop. What's your checkpoint process going to look like? What's your succession planning process going to look like? That's at the bottom of this project template. And like when you design each one, you will have sort of an SOP guide that you can hand off to a leader as they come in, and it becomes your training, part of your onboarding. that you go through that. So you're not doing the leadership training, but you're maybe explaining how the leadership training works. We might put in here for the leaders, we might put dynamic leadership. We might put in here SDT. That might become in scope because it's a foundation to the dynamic leadership. Guiding principles is an important one. So when we are moving along, and if you think about it like this, we hire leaders based on their prior experience, based on their prior results. So you think behavioral descriptive interviewing, typically we're asking questions about the past, and we're then, because the past is a good predictor, it's not the best, and it's a good predictor of the future. You're hiring people that fit this mold that you sort of set out there, right, as what you need. The problem is their past behavior is all conditioning. It's all based on conditioning. So what you're doing is you're actually hiring a set of habits and conditioning. And if you're not careful, those habits and that conditioning will play out. So suppose somebody got the results, but they used a family metaphor in managing the operation. And now you're adopting into that, you're bringing that family metaphor in, and they're working with other people. They got somebody who's using a political metaphor. Another one of your direct reports is using a bureaucratic metaphor. Another one's using a friend group metaphor. And another one is using the family metaphor. And then you wonder why there's toxicity in the organization, because there's all these mixed messages. So guiding principles is a way to cut through a lot of that. So one of the guiding principles would be, when in doubt, operate. I'll just operate as a team. Operate as a team. Another one might be expand freedom of action based on demonstrated results or demonstrated skills. In other words, we want to push on freedom of action, but we want to do it based on demonstrated skills. We want to link checkpoint meetings to 3 top priorities or something like that. You get my point. You play with this, but as you start to develop, you'll get better and better at coming up with this. I'll do the actual workshop. We'll actually do this in groups and breakout sessions and have some group coaching. So you'll start to benefit. Right now we'll just, I'm gonna go through for another 5 or 6 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A time. But the guiding principles, these are going to start to become repeated. And this is where you as the leader get to decide what are the guiding principles. Now, let's say that you're a middle manager and you're in an organization and you're not the decision maker. You can still have guiding principles within your team. Just make sure they align with the bigger organization. Obviously, you don't want to create friction, but oftentimes you'll find that organizations don't have these in place because they've just been reacting. They've been reacting. Next thing you know, they got 500 employees, and it's all bubble gum and baling wire because they've been reacting. Not quite that bad, but they've been reacting. And this is how you get these multiple metaphors operating, etc. So guiding principles, I can go on. I've used the word blue language. Always use blue language to describe. Foster a growth mindset. Don't take my guiding principles of just throwing these down here as something that I would be thinking about as I'm creating this. And then I would say support autonomy, competence, relatedness. And then the deliverables. So what are the deliverables? Well, we need sort of a roadmap of the onboarding with all of the things that have to be touched, a checklist, we need some informative videos. I'll say three informative videos. so you don't have to keep saying the same thing over and over. And you as the leader can be speaking directly to people. Imagine how cool that would be, is in that in the onboarding process, there's a 20-minute video where the employee is hearing you talk about some of these things as the leader, and you update that video from time to time as things come out of it. But just imagine how cool that would be, having 3 informative videos. And I would think that there might be some kind of an assessment, and that assessment would be based on, uncover some of their strengths, but also uncover some of their opportunities. And then I think that there's up here in the guiding principles, I would definitely want to say, engage, understand to the degree that they are comfortable, their purpose. And a lot of people don't know their purpose. But you can ask these questions. These questions may seem wonky, but they are so powerful. You ask a question like, what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? I know you just took this job, and with the volatility and uncertainty that's in the workplace, and I mean in the business sector, globalization is always going to be the possibility of a new opportunity showing up. And what we want to do is make sure we organize the work in a way that makes sense. So to help me organize the work in a way that makes sense, I'm going to ask you some questions and just answer freely, top of mind. I'm not going to hold you to it, but it just gives me a sense of directionality in terms of organizing work. What would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? I had actually one employee would not want to tell me this because they thought that I was going to organize the work. And then we ended up having a really good working relationship because their trust bar was so high. They had been burned so many times. Their trust bar was so high. They just couldn't believe that I wasn't going to somehow use this information against them. But it turned out that over time, and they found out that I was really sincere. They talked to other people. They actually came back to me and said, I want to have that conversation with you again because I feel better about answering the question, something like that. And then we had the conversation. Anyway, you don't know what you're going to get, but you'll get better at asking the questions. And I would say if you're having difficulty, don't blame the people, not blame yourself, but look at different ways of doing it. What would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? If you didn't have to work for a living, if you didn't have to get paid, what kind of work would you do? And then another question is similar to that, and it is, what would you do professionally if you didn't have to work? So let's say you weren't working, you decided to just do stuff on your own time. What would you do that was similar to professional if you didn't have to work, or you chose not to work? And then the last one is assumptions. And assumptions are, you could use gating here, right? So these are things that you're not sure what's going to happen. And so the assumption is, if we're going to be able to put this software in place and we're going to be able to market it at this level, and that could be a gate. So you want to make sure that that assumption comes true before. But the point is, there's some things in here we want to know what we don't know, and then make a decision. Are we going to gate that? Like, for example, I was using the kid riding a bicycle, learning to ride a bicycle. If they can't, that I expect that I can get them to pedal fast enough to keep their balance by the end of the day. That's an assumption, and that becomes a gate. If they can't pedal fast enough to keep their balance, then we're not going to go to the next step on the second day. That's not the best example. Another one might be that people do want to have this kind of thing bundled, that you want to do some testing. You don't want to build out this whole thing. You want to do the gating early. It's a good example. It came up. I got this from In Search of Excellence, I think. And this company was building jet engines. One of the requirements of when you're building a jet engine is that it has to pass what they call a 20 chicken test. So the engine is operating at full speed, and they throw, I guess, grocery store chickens. They throw these chickens, shoot these chickens out of a cannon at this jet engine. And the jet engine has to be able to take those chickens and keep operating. It makes sense, right? Because if it flew into a flock of birds, you want it to keep operating. This particular jet engine company manufacturer, it was a 3-year manufacturing cycle, and they were in the 3rd year. They were at the end, and that's when they did the 20 chicken test, and it failed. And they were set back 2.5 years. They had to go all the way back because the reason it failed was so deep, so so long ago in terms of the design or the manufacturer that they had to basically start over. So you want to do the equivalent of the 20 chicken test as early as possible. Let's call it 20 chicken test. And most projects, most things that you're going to be doing now, what would it be in the context of the onboarding? It would be that I can explain, my leaders can explain this in a way that makes sense, or that I can use the terminology autonomy, competence, relatedness, and people are going to know what I mean. That might be an assumption, or that people that we're hiring will be interested in discussing some of these points. And then on the back, this is just I created this because I started working with, it was for like influencers and people who were not part of my organization, more independent contractors. And I started creating the backside just to give them some context, because the front side, if you're talking to your leaders and your managers, they kind of, it's self-explanatory. But on the backside, I had the appendix. I wanted them to understand some things or give them some more notes. And I don't always use all of it, but like the sub project part one would be testing. I want to do some testing of the onboarding. I want to separate out of the orientation what doesn't belong there, orientation versus onboarding. And maybe I want to have my leaders build a prototype. I want to build a prototype and share it with my leaders. And I even want to have an on-ramp. So on-ramps are powerful, right? Because rather than wait until you have the entire on-ramp onboarding thing designed, what you can do is just do two things and have your leaders do those two things with their employees. You get the idea. So that's the sub projects one, sub project two, and then follow up. So by the way, I didn't mention this. This works best as a facilitated document. I like doing it on a flip chart where everybody can see. So this is more of an individual worksheet, but I like doing it on a flip chart where everybody can see. And they feed off of each other's ideas, and that way your whole team walks out of there. So in the case of an onboarding design, I would have maybe HR in there, and I might have one or two of my leaders who are in the process of hiring new people. They would be in there. I would definitely want to have somebody who's thinking like me, but also have somebody who's going to push back. And then you create this, and you'll get better and better as you do it. So that's it. I'm going to see if we have any questions. Let's first, I want to, again, if you're in the webinar, you'll see this. I'm going to invite by putting a link here. And if you click on this link, you can invite yourself onto the stage. If you're in the audio event, all you have to do is raise your hand and I'll see it. And I'll just alternate between the two. So I'm going to just do Q&A now. Let's see if I get anybody coming on. And let me make sure all my screens are right. We're going to switch this back over to here. All right. So let's see if we have anybody coming on, and we'll do some Q&A. Let me grab something for one moment while I'm waiting. All right, so I've got some questions here just to fill in the, so I don't have all this, have any dead space. Let's see. Oops. One question, what strategies do you recommend for helping the team navigate their own subconscious habits to enhance productivity? So I think the biggest thing a leader can do is understand that 95% of what we do is done by habit. And that habit is based on associations from the past. So typically, if somebody's doing something by habit, there's something in their past that made it, that linked up that doing it that way is a good thing. So you have to come from a positive intent perspective. But then what you want to do is literally create pauses in the interaction. So they're going to, if they're doing things by habit, that means their reaction has become the equivalent of their response. They react a certain way, and then that becomes the response. And you don't want the reaction to equal the response, because the reaction is based on associations and habits from the past. We want the response to be something where the conscious mind comes in and looks at the assessment, does an assessment. So we have the stimulus or the cue, and then we have the reaction. That becomes a data point. So as the leader, what you can do with your employees or team members is ask them questions to keep taking them back to before the reaction. Well, let me just ask you this: what are some of the thoughts that cause you to come up with that perspective? You don't challenge them. Why do you say that? That's just going to make them double down. But you go back to, let me just ask you a nuanced question. Suppose it's like this, or you could do some reframing. You could reframe the meaning. So what happens if it was a different kind of situation? That the thing you just described with John, let me just put it in a different context, and let's take Mary. Mary might be their boss's boss, right? So that's how you saw it with John. Suppose Mary did that same exact behavior. How would you describe it? So you would do some reframing conversations like that just to keep breaking that pattern. You're gonna. It's obviously this is a shorter term fix. There's some bigger work you can. That's why I do the transformation program, and I do the high performance self coaching. If you go back, in fact, if you watch that high performance self coaching, you'll see the model that I use, and you can actually do that as a leader. But you want to disrupt that process. You recognize that they're going from reaction and it's their response, but the reaction is from some positive intent from the past, but it may not be the appropriate thing now. That's just one example. In what ways can this be used to uh, build to build a leadership development within an organization? I think the point is that you want to have a development. You want to look at what is the evolution of a leader, and I would say it starts with what's the first thing they need to know your operation, but then they have to be able to communicate. They have to have self leadership first, right? They've got to have some personal leadership first. Then they've got to be able to interact with others. They have to be able to frame things in such a way. They have to frame an argument. They have to be able to stay objective in a difficult debate or situation. They have to be able to recognize and have their own self-awareness when they're being biased, right? So these are just some steps in the road on that roadmap that as examples. But as a leader, for a leader, I would definitely have, they've got to be able to introduce a controversial topic or a controversial change. I want to be able to assess that. And I'm not going to say you manufacture these, but if we've got to convey something that's difficult and we're going to do an email, I might say, well, for training and development, I want to watch this person present it in a live event. You see what I'm doing? I'm taking skills that I need and I'm finding opportunities to assess it. I hired them as leader. I'm pretty sure they can handle this, but I just want to observe it. I want to see how they handle it. I want to see how they handle pressure. Because here's the thing: in the high stakes moments, we don't know how these people react to stress. We don't know how what their survival reactions are going to take them to, and those survival reactions create opportunities for development. What methods do you recommend for measuring the effectiveness of change initiatives in training programs? It's all situational, but I think you want to come back to what's the desired outcome. Here's the thing I would say. recognize that 95% of what we do is done by habit, which means that most of the initial responses that people are going to come up with are probably more associations which come from the past. So you want to always be cutting the deck on that. And if we're looking at effectiveness, I want to go back to measure what. First, let's define what is effectiveness. What does it mean to be effective? And then you break that down. And then how could we measure this? But you can always go back to the context reframing. Well, let's take it to a different context and see, does it still apply? And then you could do a meaning reframing. Well, let's say it didn't mean that. Let's say it actually is telling you this, right? And then just to keep cutting that deck. And so as the leader, you're becoming a facilitator. And this gets back to dynamic leadership. I think facilitation is an important skill for dynamic leadership. As a solopreneur, how can I apply these concepts to manage my time and increase my productivity? I think that if you look at the development plan and you use this project plan as a guide, and the roadmap, I meant the roadmap, you look at the roadmap, I think you can create, like, you can think of it in the context of a customer journey. And as you bring customers in, making sure that they're aware of how things are going to play out. Here's what we're going to be doing. I use this project template with clients to design. I co-design with them what the outcome is going to be. I want to have us both on the same page. And it's great because, again, it usually doesn't change because you're doing it in a safe environment. You're not under stress. When people are in a stress response, they're going to come up with different answers. You want to fill this out when they're not having a stress response. How does this interplay with human resources? I think the bigger point is that you want to make sure that human resources roles and responsibilities are clearly defined in your organization. So I got everybody coming in. Are clearly defined in your organization. Too often, people look at HR and say, well, they have all the development work, all the stuff that's developmental leadership or management, that's all under HR. And I think that's a challenge to do it that way because they're not the ones. It's sort of like having the administrative office be the ones who are dictating what the plays are going to be on the field for the sports team. It doesn't work that way. And I think when leaders abdicate the orientation and onboarding to human resources, I think they're making a huge mistake. And this is why we get toxicity. Again, it contributes to toxicity because now you have these different metaphors out there, whether it's team or bureaucratic or political or friend group or whatever it might be, command and control. And you want to have more of a team metaphor. And then you also have those steps in place, as I mentioned, to not have internal. So HR can become defense, right? You have an internal defense, but you shouldn't be fighting against. What I mean by that is a lot of times HR is there to make sure we don't get sued. HR is there to make sure we're following the regulations. They're the ones who are making sure you're having the right amount of continuing education, or you're doing these, like in the US, it's sexual harassment and hostile workplace. You got to have annual training. That's HR function. That's different than the checkpoint that we're doing. We're talking about how to be at our best performance. All right, so that is it. I hit the hour mark. I'm going to leave it there. I will leave this up. It's going to be I'll leave it up for a week or so because this is going to be it's a 2-hour event. I'll leave that in my LinkedIn Live. You'll be able to catch it there as a recording. And feel free to send me messages if you want to see other topics or you have questions, and I'll answer them along the way. We'll see you. Thanks for joining.